Hey, hello and welcome everyone to the January episode of the bi-monthly FR Panorama webinar series. I'm Larry Liberti, and together with my colleague Mario Alanis, we will be hosting today's seminar. We're thrilled that you're all here today. In fact, you are one of more than 600 registrants for today's seminar. You actually represent more than 30 companies, 15 regulatory agencies, and more than 24 NGOs, patient, and trade associations from all around the world. In fact, you represent colleagues from Asia, Europe, North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and Africa. I think this is a testament to the ongoing interest in the concept of regulatory science. This series was created to help stakeholders gain a practical understanding around how to implement and refine or just consider the use of reliance pathways. Naturally, everyone has questions about reliance. From industry to agencies, patients, and others, each has a goal of how reliance can play a role in accelerating the availability of safe, effective, and quality medicines. It's our hope that by participating in these webinars, you'll gain practical advice to address your questions. Regulatory reliance is a concept that has been around for quite a number of years now. As you know, regulatory reliance, especially when it comes to the authorization of medicines, it's a process by which an agency can take into consideration the documentation, inspections, decisions made by reliant agencies to inform their own sovereign decisions about the acceptance of a medicine for their own population. It can be used during the pre-approval period, for example, with various forms of inspections, for the actual authorization, and during the post-approval period to help expedite post-approval changes. The concept of reliance, though, is a form that is distinct from recognition. So reliance is distinct from recognition. In recognition, an agency takes the decision of a reference agency as the formal basis for accepting a medicine. In this webinar, then, we'll be focusing on the concept of reliance. Naturally, there are nuances around the use of reliance, but it's not the intention of this webinar series to delve into the specifics of the various forms of reliance pathways or the background concepts that have formed the concept of reliance. We're sure that by now you have a basic understanding of the concept and that you're here to learn more about the practical aspects of how to use reliance. So it's in this spirit that the FR Panorama webinar series was created. FR Panorama is an educational program of the RUD Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which is the sponsor of the FRPath project. If you haven't already checked it out, the FRPath project offers a unique source of information about facilitated regulatory pathways, including reliance pathways, and you can access it at the URL noted below. We're grateful for the support provided by MSD for the FR Panorama series too. And we're also indebted to our advisory committee for the input and guidance that the members have given us regarding the topics and outcomes of each of these webinars. This year, the overall series is organized into two broad categories. The first two webinars, this one and the upcoming March webinar, focus on the concept of why and who should use reliance pathways. The remaining four webinars in 2023 then focus on how to use reliance. In each of our webinars, we'll be joined by three guests who'll take a particular point of view in providing us with insights into this specific topic for the webinar. Each presenter will give us their thoughts and, more importantly, will provide us with a practical recommendation that you can use right away in your activities. Consequently, with each webinar, you'll be able to walk away with three concepts for you to consider implementing as relevant to your organization. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions of our guests for clarification immediately after each of their short presentations, and then also during the panel conversation using the chat box. Mario, I'd like to to you.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you very much for the introduction. You are right in that we have seen a growing interest in the use of Reliance across the world at the agency and company level. As we all know, particularly after the COVID pandemic, it has increased a lot. You know, based on a quick scan that all of our audience can enter the FRPath database, we have identified more than 65 pathways for medicines authorizations from around the world that are based on some kind of reliance. Although there are some common themes, we see wide diversity in many characteristics. For example, which references agencies are used, what's their target time, that they range from 30 to 180 days, and then there is variable use of CPP. All of these and other characteristics we can see, and we see some common themes. But what this tells us is that there is a great opportunity to identify areas for further consistency and best practices. One measure of the excitement, the world excitement around this topic, has been the number of guidelines, white papers, and positions papers that have been published in the last 3 years to provide some continuity and context to the use of these pathways. And these have been critical in laying the groundwork for the use of Reliance. So, Larry, let's get started.
Okay, thanks, Mario. Today's session will last 1 hour and 15 minutes. We hope that you find it to be an excellent use of your time. So please feel free to suggest questions in the chat box. We'll do our best to monitor those and to pose those to our guests. I just wanted to mention that every year, the FRPath project conducts a survey to better understand the environment surrounding the use of regulatory reliance. We would love for you to participate in this study, which is available through a link in SurveyMonkey. The link will be posted in the chat. If you get a minute before this webinar is over, please feel free to access the survey. It has only 2 short questions. It's very, very simple to answer. We will post the results on the FRPath website, and you can also access the survey after this webinar at the FRPath homepage. So let's get started. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Judith McDonald. Judith is well known to those of us involved with understanding the role of industry in supporting the concept of regulatory reliance. In her role in global regulatory policy development at Pfizer, she contributes internationally to the development of best practices. Optimizing the use of reliance pathways requires a thoughtful, multidisciplinary process by the sponsor. So today, Judith will talk with us about how to use the key characteristics of reliance pathways to help plan a development program. Thank you, Judith.
Thank you, Larry. If we can just display the slides. Okay, great. Just put these on full screen. Just bear with me while I just get these on full screen, so it'll be a little bit easier. That's the usual disclaimer. I don't seem to be able to get them on full screen, Larry. Sorry about that. Just having a little bit of a technical issue here in advancing the slides as well. Okay, are you seeing my slides? Can I just confirm? Hello, I'm hoping you can see the slides.
Why don't we go with that, Judith? Yep.
Yeah.
Go ahead if you can advance them.
Sorry about that. So yeah, as you said, Larry, I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to talk about the key characteristics of reliance pathways to plan a global development program. Usual disclaimer. So I listed on this slide here some desirable characteristics for reliance pathways. And I think, as you said there, and Maria was sharing in the introduction, there is a vast range of these pathways. And I put here from a development perspective some of the kind of desirable characteristics we'd like to see. So in terms of timelines and efficiencies, we want shorter approval times for reliance pathways compared with standard pathways. We want a transparent tracking of the status of our reviews, and we want to know when we'll get questions, and we want to get fewer questions that are duplicative. We want this to work across the life cycle, and we want there to be transparency and trust. I think also we want to make sure that reliance pathways are agile and fit for the future. So I'd like to delve a little bit further into this. So the dilemma that we face here is that because these pathways are so diverse and there's no one size fits all, we have to produce, we tend to produce generalized lists of desirable characteristics. And then the problem is, how do you actually convert that to actionable solutions that can be applied across these pathways? So I want to focus in on one area, which is the timing and format of responses to questions, both in terms of present and future needs. So on this slide here, I'm displaying a standard non-accelerated timeline of activities and considerations that we have in our company when we're planning submissions globally across multiple countries. So we start around, on the left-hand side of this diagram, around phase 2A clinical trial applications with an early list of countries where we're thinking of filing first. We then have a submission team, global submission team that's formed 18 to 24 months prior to the filing. And then we have a filing plan with all the countries and the priorities and the order locked down 12 to 18 months prior to the first submission. So I think that one key takeaway here is that that is decided a long time in advance, and we have to make the decisions about whether to use reliance pathways or the standard pathway pretty early on. And then we follow through with our submissions and review and approvals for the first round of countries, and then we expand further. So in terms of decision criteria for this global filing plan I talked about, we build it for each asset, indicating the filing order. And it's really based around three areas. There's a business priority component. There's also manufacturing capacity considerations. So we need to be not just ready for getting approvals, we need to be able to supply the products in all these markets. And then we also look at the ability of internal teams to manage meetings plus queries and responses across the globe. So we're factoring all of that into our planning. And the key question that we ask, or we get asked internally, is, are we going to put this asset into a reliance procedure? So there's some questions along there that I won't get into, but one of the key ones I want to focus on is this area of responses to questions. So many activities are occurring in parallel during the submission and review period for a product. we've got meetings with regulators to prepare for. So they could be application orientation meetings, mid-cycle, late-cycle meetings, clarifications, oral explanations, and advisory committee meetings are very resource intensive. And then we're also getting responses to questions from many different regulators around the world. And that's depicted here on this slide. But the practical reality is that these queries are raised by each national regulator very often in their own country. It goes to the local office, but they're very often answered by a relatively small team in companies of experts on the data who are also supporting lots of other activities. So for us, it's really key in that decision to use Reliance if we've got clarity on when we're going to get the questions, how we're going to get them, and that we're not going to get duplicative questions as well. So there are two main ways in which questions are received. So there's a batched approach where the questions are batched together and received at a pinpoint in time, such as what happens in the EMA centralized process, and of course access work sharing. And the other model is a continuous flow of questions on a daily basis, and that happens very often with the FDA. But Reliance procedures should save time and resources. So this is really critical for us. And as of today, in the current submission paradigm, a batched approach is helpful because it helps us to be able to plan our resourcing across the globe and across all these various submissions as companies. But in the future, submissions are moving in a different direction that I'll talk about, and we need to be ready for that. So how can we have a process for questions and answers that's agile and fit for the future? Well, we need to know where we're going. We're working smarter, not harder. I think during the pandemic, that showed us all the things that were possible, but really people worked a lot harder, and we're actually working on what practices can we take forward in a smart way that involves streamlining and reducing cycle times without reducing quality and without doubling up on the effort. For novel products, we've always had a trend for many years now towards filing earlier with phase 2 data and then supplementing later on. But we're also now moving more into the digital area of when we talk about submissions, of making documents machine readable as well as human readable, because that means we can use technology to automate some of these routine tasks. And as we do that, we can break up our PDF documents, which are really just electronic paper, into more data components and unlock better ways of knowledge management. And for questions and answers, this can look like us having the facility for a Google-like search to search for when a regulatory question, has it been raised before by another regulator, and what was the response? I think that would be a real game changer there. And also cloud-based platforms are going to enable us in the future to file our data in a more iterative way as it's generated and then release it for assessment. And this is going to transform the interaction over time. Clearly, that's a long-term direction of travel. But here on this next slide, just wanted to show you that FPA published a paper a couple of years ago on dynamic regulatory assessment, which is really expounding this principle of more of a dynamic approach to sharing information, rather than it being sort of all just supplied at the end, the sort of MAA submission, but actually filing what they call discrete data packages as they go along. And taking that concept further, it was also presented at DIA Europe last year, Cumulus Synergies working on cloud-based solutions, which will really make us have more of a living dossier, where data would be uploaded into a secure cloud-based system iteratively as it's generated, really mimicking the R&D process. And then you would have thresholds would then be reached at certain points to allow certain decision making. Clearly, you could see how moving in this direction would change how we have to think about reliance processes and bring some opportunities there. So bringing in overall recommendations for improved efficiencies in this area during reliance for questions and answers, I'd say predictability is key. We need to know when questions will be received and in what format. And I think that regulators, when designing a process for reliance, can look at when are the questions and answers going to be received, and having a milestone around that and what format is going to help the companies want to use the process. Tracking is another key area, review tracking. And we've seen signals that are very positive in that direction, with WHO introducing an electronic platform this year for their collaborative regulatory process. And then in terms of efficiency, as I mentioned, companies and regulators can look at reducing duplicative questions by using technology to enable better knowledge management. For example, having a repository where regulators could search for questions that have been asked previously, and Cumulus Synergy is looking at building those type of facilities. Then we need to be fit for the future. So we need to look where we're going with these submissions and the paradigms and stay nimble and adaptable. And then finally, I'd say that reliance has got to improve efficiency, and we have to look at ways of making the questions and answers process more efficient to enable us to take advantage of accelerated development cycles and submissions. And with that, I'll hand back to you, Larry.
You are muted, Larry.
Hi, Judith. Thank you very much. Very, very good. Really exciting to see how the digitization of information could be transformative. And we'll talk a little bit about this when we're in our panel conversations. Mario, why don't I turn it over to you, and you can introduce our next guest, Jose Cotto.
Of course. Thank you very much, Larry. It is my real pleasure to introduce my longtime friend and colleague, Jose Cotto, in his current role at the Pan American Health Organization, as well as in his previous role as head of the El Salvador Regulatory Agency. He has been active in promoting effective and efficient use of novel pathways, especially looking to understand the role of reliance and the role it can play in facilitating the availability of medicines. While there is a general agreement that using reliance has benefits, we know there are challenges. In many organizations, there is difficulties and barriers for the use of reliance. So today, Jose will share some of his experience and ideas as he talks to us about how to overcome the barriers of the utilization of reliance. Welcome, Jose. You are muted.
Okay, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity. I will focus my presentation mainly on the regulatory perspective. Okay, I will talk about challenges and barriers. And first of all, one of the most frequent and very important challenges is that reliance must be anchored in national regulatory strategy. The problem here is arising from the need to improvise without planning what produces a non-deliberative path. This improvisation produces gaps such as the normative that does not generate confidence and predictability in the regulator process. This means that it must be planned in detail, taking into account areas of reliance, resources, among others. Another important aspect to mention is generated by the traditional regulator culture that emphasizes the autonomy of function. The importance of recognition decision of other regulators demands a cultural change in the NRA's minds. In this sense, an approach must be taken, whereas there is a natural resistance to any important change. The other thing is that have to consider is a flexible approach. One measure does not fill all, so it must avoid the tendency to copy regulation without the appropriate contextualization. In the practical order, there is a need for investment and resources investment for the Reliance implementation. Sometimes this is not taking care, so we need to find the necessary resources. During the operational procedure, the regulator must verify the similarity of the product in different countries to determine that are the same that was authorized, and of course also verifies the similarity of NRA condition in order to find that this process is going to finish in a good port. Last but not least, the sector is increasingly seen as a necessary participant in regulatory process. So it must recognize the role of the pharmaceutical industry in all the process. I think this is getting better during this time. For consider the barriers of the Reliance application in the NRAs, we must think in the drug life cycle. In this matter, the medicine is going through a process that begin with an A, I, and D in order to the medicine to be born. Then the registration, the post-registration, and the changes, and then go back to beginning the next cycle. In this case, all the functions, all the function that is critical begin with the clinical trials oversight. The second thing is the marketing authorization, inspections, lot release, especially in vaccines and biologic market surveillance, and pharmacovigilance. All of these function needs to take care when you are talking about reliance. But again, one of the things that you have to take in mind is that all the reliance process has to be planning to be success. I will finish with the barriers that for me is more important. The first one is the lack of political will. There is a false misconception that the reliance go against sovereignty, and that is not true. If you do properly, you keep the decision in your country, and you will always just take care of all the details for the decision and then you will do it. The second is the lack of access to information and confidentiality. And of course, one of the biggest problem is the cultural difference. For example, language. Mainly the products that come to, for example, Latin America came for China and India and some countries with so different language structure that we have a lot of problems with difference to take care and to take in account the documentation. The second one is the regulatory requirements, because two countries has in place different requirements, and in order to take in consideration the decision, the regulatory decision, you have to know what are the regulatory requirements in that country. And of course, the last one is the operational standards. Every country has different level of maturity on the regulatory area. Maybe more of the half of the countries doesn't need the operational standard that I require to a good level of maturity. And I want to leave this message: make sure you plan for Reliance. That will complete all the process since the beginning, and also it's going to be sure that the Reliance is going to go to a good port. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose. Mario, thank you very much for introducing Jose. And I think you brought up some very, very interesting points about how to overcome some of the barriers that we're seeing that in some ways are surmountable. We can overcome them. I just want to check with our colleagues here to see if Bert Lufkins is on the line. And Bert, are you there? Okay. Well, what I'd like to do right now is bring together all of us, Jose, Judith, Mario, myself, and if we could all come on screen together. We'd like to have a little bit of a conversation amongst us. And this is where we'd ask you to provide comments in the comment box to pose to us about some of the things that you're hearing. If you have any questions specifically to the speakers, if you'd like to be able to clarify some issues, or if there are things that you'd like us to delve into in more detail. We did have a couple of questions already that have come in, and I thought I'd start out by posing one of them to both of our speakers, which is kind of a general question. And it is, what do you think we need to do to ensure that reliance procedures are actually fit for purpose today, and also that they're fit for purpose for the future? So how do we future-proof these procedures? Now, I think we need to narrow down our conversation perhaps around certain activities, and if you'd like to just talk about registration or inspections, that's okay. But what are your feelings about how do we work towards ensuring that these reliance procedures continue to be fit for purpose as they evolve? And why don't we start with Judith and then Jose?
Thank you, Larry. I think today what we really need as companies is the sort of the predictability of when we think about the questions. As I showed on the slides, we get this sort of deluge of questions, and we want to roll our products out to as many countries as we possibly can, and we can do that more effectively if we know when we're going to get the questions, in what format, if they're going to be batched together or we're just going to get them as and when. It really just helps us then to plan. I think for the future, we really need to be, all of us, industry, regulators, everybody needs to have their eyes and ears open to where we're going in the future, because certainly the future is digital submissions and is this more a kind of living dossier, which actually gives us some things we need to think about and some kind of opportunities there to have, perhaps better information exchange, because that's always an issue with Reliance. It's actually, getting access to assessment reports and things like that. But also, as I mentioned, trying to use digital to automate some things and to have better knowledge management, to have, if you could, as a regulator, for example, access very easily and search very easily for any questions that have been raised previously on the particular product with the answers, hopefully that would mean that you would not have to raise that question again, because it's already been answered and you can see the answer there. So I think that would help the efficiency as well in the future.
Right. I think we can all look forward to that day. Jose, do you have any thoughts about this concept?
I didn't get the question. I have some
Sure. So essentially,
audio
what the
issues.
question. Okay. So the question was, what do you think we need to do to be sure that Reliance procedures are actually fit for today, and maybe thinking of the future? What might be things that we need to think about for the future?
Okay, one of the main problem that we deal in the last pandemic approach with some of the needs to very fast reliance process, especially in the authorization of the medicines, is that difficult to share information in a secure and fast way. You need information from the stakeholders, from the industry, from the regulators, from the patient also. And I think that is one of the mainly focus that you have to consider for the future. I think we have enormous facility in share information, but it must be secure way and very fast, because when you need the information, you rarely have it right away. So I think that is one of the things that I have to consider. It's one of the biggest challenge. And the other one is that there is a very high asymmetries with the regulators. So I don't know if, for example, we can accept some of the decision from one of the weak regulators, and so we have to redo the decision. And I think that's mean that we have to know better each other. Thank you.
Right. And I think we'll come back to this concept of knowing each other and interacting. I think that's actually a question that's come up. And this is a question that we're going to discuss in the next webinar in March. And the question is this. It says, Reliance seems to me that it's important to the companies, but how important is it to a regulatory officer, to the regulator in different countries? Is it a priority for the regulators? And I'd like Mario, who has served in the regulatory capacity, to think a little bit about this and maybe give us his thoughts. And then also, Jose, if you could think about it. And then Judith, from your point of view, why is Reliance important for the agency? So why don't we start with Mario, then Jose, and then Judith?
Yes, thank you very much, Larry. That's a very interesting question, and I think it's really important to have in mind as a regulator what is your objective. What is it that you want to do? Is it a regulator part of the health, protecting citizens from health? Because sometimes regulators might be inclined or to be influenced by industrial decisions or by economic, but not really caring about health. And I think that's a very, very important for regulators to be clear that their main responsibility is to uh, protect the population from any risk health related and help their population become more healthy. And in that sense, but then as Jose mentioned, the political will is influenced in these circumstances because there are different interests there. But it's certainly a very important point, and I think Jose was a very, as I recall, a leading player a few years ago when he was head of El Salvador, and how he implemented some reliance practices and a big transformation. And I'm sure he can talk more about these issues. I ask you, Jose, what do you think?
Well, first of all, of course, it's very important for all the regulators. But I am not sure that all the regulators know that this is very important for the life of the regulation functions. As I think that one of the best idea is to maximize the lack of resources that the regulator has. If you build a very strong reliance process, you can utilize this is in the economy of the administration process. You will have more resources to use in other things that has to be with your country. And the second thing is that some of the requires to make a good decision in the regulatory process has to deal with some resources that the country doesn't have. For example, some laboratory tests that the country don't have any facility where it's taking place. They have to be and other regulator did the work and you used that result. So I think that for a country that deal with the lack of resources, reliance is a good option to optimize the lack that they have. Thank you.
Thank you. And Judith, what do you think? You've done a lot of work working with agencies. How do you think this helps an agency?
Well, I think, Larry, one of the things that isn't always emphasized as much as it could be, and building a little bit on what Jose said, is reliance is this means of freeing up national resources. We know that many of the countries are very strapped for resources, and there are certain things that can only happen nationally. So if a product is, from a local company, not being filed anywhere else, and they need to do assess that locally. They need to inspect a factory. They need to have that capability to be able to do that. So if they are using reliance for some of these other activities, it frees up the time to do that. But I think not only does it do that, I think it also helps with regulatory system strengthening, because I think it was mentioned earlier that the agencies are all on a journey, and they're all at sort of different levels of capability and capacity. And as they collaborate more and more, they're actually learning as well how the other regulators are doing things in practice, and that helps to strengthen the national system. So I think it's a strong message that we want to have strong national regulatory systems. Reliance is not doing away with that, it's actually enhancing it. and using your resources in a smart fashion.
Right, right. No, I think being able to optimize resources is certainly a critical component. We will be covering all of these topics in the March workshop, where we're talking about the concept of Relionomics, which we've come up with, which has to do with looking at all of these multiple characteristics that a company might take into account when thinking whether to use reliance, and an agency, the same thing. So when we think about reliance, we have a couple of questions that sort of tie together, and I'll try to link a few of them. One is, what are the factors that regulators consider in their risk-based decisions, and to what extent can reliance be practiced for certain products or activities? But facilitating that, we've had a question about this, is how do we use the established memorandum of understanding and confidentiality agreements and other agreements that are already in place among many nations, many organizations? So how do we tie together the flexibility that could come from those relationships with this concept of how do you implement a risk-based decision to be able to use reliance? So would anybody like to chime in on that? Jose, you were very involved in getting a number of Central American countries to think about reliance together. And can you tell us a little bit about how the concept of memorandum of understanding and other agreements had played a role in the way that you got countries to talk about reliance together?
Well, first of all, I think it's very difficult for a country and an agency to come with a documentation, especially if they have to go to the Congress or the assemblies, national assemblies, because that process could take 1 or 2 years. So I think you have to develop a process more quick, in order that all the decisions that you have to make come on time. But in a risk approach, you have to take in consideration, first of all, what are the risks of the decision that we are making? Because it is not, for example, it is not the same risk that if you have, for example, a chemical synthesis medicines that is very simple versus an biotechnological product. The decision, it is very different in terms of risk. And the second one is also the frequently that you are going to be in that phenomenon. For example, if it's a product that is going to come rarely to the country, you can step aside that decision. But if, for example, you are dealing with a new vaccine for a new disease that is very frequently in your country, the decision is going to have to be very quick, and the reliance process, it's have to be a special a quick path in order that the decision is not take forever, and you will have in time for sanitary issues. So I think that is 2 or 3 things that you have to be aware in the national regulatory agencies.
Yeah, and thank you for touching on that concept of risk-based. Mario, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I would like to comment, because on several things. I've seen some comments that there is belief that reliance is important for companies and it's not for regulatory agencies. And I would like to disagree on this, but I think that this is a topic that in some that there is some resistance Certainly, for companies, it's important because it allows to shorten times, and companies want to take the products of their years of research to different countries. It's in their interest. But I would like to claim that it's also very important for regulatory agencies because regulatory agencies want to protect the health of the population where they are. So it's in their interest too. It's in both interests. It's not that the interest of one against the other ones. I think it's common interest for both sides if you want to work on this, and that's why we have seen a lot of growth in different manners of reliance, even more stringent agencies in a way. For example, Orbis, for cancer products. Well, it's jointly evaluating, but then uh, agencies can rely on what the others are evaluating, what part. And then we have um, Access, it's another group of stringent agencies. And you have different examples of how Reliance it's avoiding duplication and making a better utilization of your resources. And in that sense, I think it is very important, and it is also in the interest of the regulatory agencies.
Yeah. So
Um,
this is a really interesting concept because, we've been talking about reliance, and someone has brought up the the question, is reliance actually the right term? And as we talked about at the very beginning, and Jose mentioned, and I think we all recognize that reliance does not in any way impact a sovereign decision that an agency can make. That reliance is a way of informing one's own decision. And so the nuances of the word could be debated. I think we've all agreed that we like the idea of reliance because we are relying on other information to help inform a decision. So I think that's very helpful. Someone has asked, and maybe Judith, you can talk a little bit about this. We know that EMA and FDA already do some form of reliance for certain kinds of activities, but the question is, could it be even broader, whereby the EMA and FDA might rely on each other for authorization decisions? Now, this is obviously a highly evolved question that we don't know what direction they would go. But I think the broader question is, amongst mature regulators, how could reliance play a role with them? And what's your feeling around some of the activities that have been going on already within that concept?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we clearly have sort of recognition, actually, more than reliance, in terms of the mutual recognition of inspections between FDA and EMA, for example. I don't think we're actually going to see, as going as far as actual recognition of decisions, like a complete black box, tick. And in fact, I believe that the FDA is not actually legally, they cannot rely on another authority for sort of taking a decision. But that said, there's clearly, increased collaboration across the sort of the stringent regulatory authorities, and we know that term is changing to sort of listed authorities. So I think it's really a question of what actual mechanisms make sense, depending on the sort of maturity of the agencies and what we're what we're actually seeing there.
Yeah, and that kind of leads into another question that somebody had posted earlier, which is there a role for organizations? For instance, they mentioned ICH to bring alignment to reliance, and perhaps Jose, you've had some experience with this, with PAHO, and can you talk about the role of organizations like PAHO in bringing a more level playing field and an ability to understand what direction reliance pathways are taking and where their alignment could be.
I don't know, Larry, if I can share some chart, because I think it's important to clarify some concept about the difference between reliance and recognition.
Sure, if you
Perfect.
feel free to. Let's see if we can manage that.
Okay.
I'll just ask our technician to share.
It is on screen.
There you go. Yes, we can see it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. This is the different steps that who recognize on the way to the reliance process, and it mainly comprehension and harmonization begin with some interchange of information, then the sharing the work, for example, an inspection, and then come reliance, and the last step is the recognition. And reliance is not recognition, but in some way you can go again. For example, if you have like a product registration in one country, and you will take that registration as as it was from you, that is recognition. So this is a process work that begin with some interchange of information and documentation, and finally you will rely in the work of the other agency.
That's very good, because often there are confusions. But I would like, Jose, to ask you, based on this chart that you presented, there is a lot of expectation on the Central America joint evaluation. There is this shared work, and in a way, it's a kind of reliance, because you are basing your decisions on what others do in some parts of the dossier. Could you share how is it going and what's the expectation in this sense? Because I think it's a very important, not only to facilitate access, but it's a training and learning opportunity among peers. So
yeah, okay. Well, Mario, I think the future of regulation is based on how you take serious reliance with other authorities. Because if you are thinking that every country is going to straining the regulatory system in the country, it will take forever. Some of the countries has just a little of human resources and a little experience, and the complication and a modernization of the production of health products are getting so difficult for an agency with a lack of resources to evaluate it and to make decision, that I think the future has to be the reliance process. So that's why I think we have to plan very properly, in order that you don't miss any of the regulatory areas, and you take care of quality assurance and efficacy of the products. In Central American, we are starting with the dossier evaluation in all the countries, and we open this mechanism. PAHO is helping as a technical consultant to the mechanism. And as you were asking, Larry, this organization can help, like PAHO, can help in the technical aspect of the regulatory functions, because we cannot do any decision for the countries, but you can just give some information and the state of the art of every aspect of the process. And I think that's it's going to be for me a good lesson for the future. And the experience that we get from the emergency authorization of the vaccines last year give us a good example. What can we do if we work as a regulator together and rely in the different aspect of the decisions?
That's very important. And so we had two comments that were related to what you just said and what Judith mentioned before, and they have to do with training, and then what are sort of simple steps to get started to facilitate the use of Reliance. And the first is that when we talk about risk-based assessments, it means that you need the capacity to do a risk-based analysis. You need the skills and the personnel to be able to do that. So it seems like training is an important component. And maybe Judith and Jose, can you talk a little bit about how training not only people within the pharma companies to know how to use Reliance, but also at the agencies to be able to do risk-based assessments, how that could be better supported?
Yeah, I think there's a place there for, we saw it a lot during COVID, of some of the less well-resourced regulators were actually sitting along, following the assessment of sort of EMA, etc., and actually really, in effect, learning as they went along there about what was important and what's not, because we were talking about a risk-based approach. So you kind of need to know what's important, what to worry about and what not to worry about. And I think that's, more and more of that, where sort of agencies are following another agency's assessment, maybe an EMA or an FDA or something like that, and actually learning what are the important factors could be key there.
Yeah. And Jose, you find that training is important?
Oh yeah, we are working as an organization. We are working in a training itinerary for regulators, and that will be mainly online. And but I think in the next year we are going to come up with this itinerary that it's self-assess. You are going to first decide where you can start and the areas of expertise that you wanted to get. And this process starts with taking all the effort in the academy, the industry organization, some regulators, and make an inventory what is available now. And we are now finishing this training itinerary. And I think in the next months, we are going to be open for the regulators. And also, we are going to give some spaces to the industry, because I think both has to be training so we can talk the same language and try to eliminate the barriers of the language. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Our last comment, I think, is right in the spirit of the FRPath webinar series, because we're looking for simple approaches to implementing Reliance and what are the kind of the first steps that can be done. And this last comment was about, could it be a useful approach to actually start using Reliance in what might be called life cycle decisions first. So using it for labeling updates, post-approval changes, and then eventually move on to something a little bit more sophisticated, like a full NDA, BLA assessment. So just to finish up real quick, Jose, what are your thoughts around that in terms of using that as a starting point? And then Judith, I'll give you the final word.
Okay, I will begin with make an inventory of what is the area of reliance that you are now doing in your agency. I think I don't know a single agency that are not using Reliance process. After making this inventory, you can start with the planification. Make sure you plan for Reliance. And you can take all the regulatory function to make this plan. Thank you.
Very good.
And over to you, Judith, for the last point.
Yes, I think the post-approval phase looks, we want Reliance to work there. And I think the question was, can we start there? Is it easier? I think what we found is that sometimes it can actually be harder because sometimes there isn't an assessment report that's been done on a particular variation. And then it makes it difficult for the agency who's relying to actually put that into practice. So, yeah, also the rules around what's a major change in one market isn't a major change in other markets. So it sounds like it might be the easiest place to start, but I would say in reality, it may actually not be, and it may actually be better to start with the MAAs where you've got a full assessment report, and very often public assessment reports that don't need MOUs, etc., to be in place.
Now there you go. There's a brilliant way of looking at two sides of the coin. Thanks very much. Wow, this has been a very, very special webinar. I think our guests have provided us with really brilliant overviews and more importantly with specific activities that we each can think about and how they relate to our own organizations. I think importantly, we can each think about this. What can our organization do? Is there one thing that I picked up today that will make my organization do something a little bit better, a little bit differently? And how can we see that having an implication with regard to how my organization looks at reliance pathways? I'd like to summarize the findings from today. There are three things that I think we'd like to leave you with. And the first is working to engage more downstream players. Bert was unable to join us today, but his presentation was going to be about how various stakeholders are important to bring into the regulatory decision, especially where reliance is concerned. So we know that patients, healthcare professionals, public health people, payers, NGOs all play a role. So what can you do to engage those people? The second bullet, and we've just lost our bullet here, the second bullet is to promote reliance efficiencies. And as Judith had mentioned, further efficiencies in trying to handle questions and answers and review tracking. These are the kinds of things with the advances in digitization and just simple project management that can facilitate how reliance runs smoothly. And the third and last bullet is based on the work that Jose has been doing and his encouragement to really look for transparency, to take a step to have interactions between the regulators and the pharmaceutical industry, that there should be an openness to have discussions early on, especially if you are using reliance, that it is an open opportunity to think about how to optimize the use of these pathways. So if you can think about doing something tomorrow that would open up the opportunity between your organization and another organization to have this conversation, that would be a good takeaway. I'd like to finish up by reminding you that a recording of this session will be archived shortly on the FRPath website. And we hope that you will use the suggestions and the observations, the discussions that have come from our conversations today in your activities. As a reminder, our next webinar, which we mentioned, will be held in mid-March, and it's entitled Onomics, documenting the benefits and potential unfavorable impacts of reliance pathways. And it's exactly the topic that was brought up in the comments section. How do we know that these are actually good for our particular organization, whether we're a company or an agency or another organization? We'll be sending reminders and details to you in the near future. And so once again, just a very, very special thank you to our guests, Judith and Jose. Remember to visit the FRPath website for more information about Reliance and other pathways. And don't forget to participate in that Reliance survey, which can be found on the website if you haven't already done so. And with that, Mario and I would like to thank you for your interest and for your participation, for all the comments that you provided. If you do have additional comments, please feel free to stay in touch with us through the website. And until we meet again, all our best.
Thank you.